At 1 a.m, the rain over Boston's seaport came down cold enough to soak straight through wool. In the narrow alley between the Rourke Harbor Tower and the brick wall of an old parking garage, under a single yellow bulb above a service door, a woman knelt on the soaked concrete with both hands braced on the ground in front of her, her head bowed so low that her hair touched the street. Her white blouse was plastered to her shoulders. One high heel lay on its side half a meter away, which meant she hadn't sat down there. She'd fallen, and she wasn't making a sound. She was only pulling in short, broken breaths, the way people do when they're trying to swallow something far too big to swallow. At the mouth of the alley, Beckett Rourke stood perfectly still. 34 years old, charcoal overcoat, no watch, no ring, a faded scar along his left cheekbone he'd never explained to anyone. In South Boston, there were men who ran companies, and there were men who decided which companies got to exist, and for 11 years he'd been the second kind. His car was already idling at the curb. He hadn't meant to turn down this alley at all. Then he saw the hair clip, and he stopped breathing, because he'd seen that hair clip every single morning since the autumn she started working for him, on the head of the woman who set a cup of tea on his desk at 7:15 sharp and had never once been late. Her name was Adeline Marsh. She was 28, and she'd never asked him for anything in her life. She wasn't supposed to let him see her like this. He wasn't supposed to care. But he walked into that alley anyway, and what Beckett Rourke did in the next 60 seconds is something the people who work for him still won't say out loud. Stay with us, because before this night is over, you'll understand exactly why a woman who never asks for anything ends up on her knees in the rain, and what it costs a man like that to finally look down. If stories about dignity and about the things people carry in silence are your kind of story, go ahead and hit that like button, share it with someone who could use it tonight, and subscribe, because there's a new one every week. Now let's go back to that alley, back to the rain, and back to the moment a man half of Boston was afraid of, bent down and picked up a stranger's shoe. He bent down, picked up the shoe with 2 fingers, turned it upside down to let the water drain out, then placed it on the concrete exactly an arm's reach from her hand. After that, he stepped back, just 1 step, but enough to leave a space between them that she could cross on her own. From inside the car, through the window lowered halfway, Bo Hendricks saw everything. He had driven for Beckett Rourke long enough to know that this man had never stepped back for anyone, in any room, and he sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel, unable to understand what he had just witnessed. Adeline planted her palms on the ground and pushed herself up. Her knees shook so badly that she had to brace herself once more before she could stand steadily, and when she finally straightened, rainwater ran from her hair down her neck and beneath her collar, yet she still didn't lift a hand to wipe it away. She slipped her foot into the shoe, slowly and carefully, as though it were the most important thing in the world. Then she raised her eyes to him. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was hoarse, and the words escaped before she had time to think. The reflex of someone who had apologized so many times in her life that it had become a kind of greeting. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rourke. I didn't know you were staying this late." He didn't answer. He looked down at her left hand, where she was clutching a supermarket plastic bag softened by the rain, holding it against her stomach the way someone might hold a child. The moment his gaze settled there, she immediately moved the bag behind her back. The gesture was quick, neat, and desperate. Through the cloudy plastic, he could make out a piece of gray fabric folded into a careful square, folded so precisely that it could only have been done by someone who had folded and refolded it many times. Beckett didn't ask. He looked away, up toward the yellow light buzzing above the service door, then spoke in the most ordinary voice he had. "My car is parked out there." "There's no need, sir," she answered immediately. "I take the bus. The night route runs until almost 2 o'clock. It's raining." "The stop has a shelter, sir." She said it with a smile. That was the worst part. That smile, the way she lifted the corners of her mouth while her eyes were still red and her chin was still trembling, the way someone smiles after learning to do it in circumstances where no one should ever have to smile. "You should go home first. I'll still be there at 7:15 tomorrow morning, right on time. I've never missed it." "I know you've never missed it. Then you don't need to worry." She shifted slightly to one side, preparing to go around him toward the mouth of the alley, and her third refusal was the most reasonable one, the hardest to argue with, delivered in the voice of an assistant arranging her employer's schedule. "I live all the way in Dorchester, completely in the opposite direction from you. Your driver has already been waiting all evening. I don't want to trouble anyone else." Beckett remained still. Rain ran along the collar of his wool coat, and he let it. He thought about 2.5 years of mornings at 7:15, about cups of tea placed on his desk without a sound, about the thousands of things this woman had taken care of for him without his ever having to ask. And he realized that in all that time, she had never once asked him for anything, not to leave early, not for an advance on her salary, not even for someone to ask how she was doing. Then he called her name. Adeline. She went completely still. Since the autumn she first walked into that building, he had never called her by her first name. Not once. And hearing that name come from his mouth sounded so unfamiliar that it struck her more deeply than any command could have. She turned back. He didn't say anything else. He simply stood there, and he didn't repeat the offer, didn't explain, didn't persuade. He waited, and in the narrow alley between the tower bearing his name and the brick wall of an old parking garage, the woman who had never asked anyone for anything finally nodded, the smallest nod, then followed him toward the waiting car with its engine still running. Beau opened the rear door. He watched her sit down with the plastic bag held tightly against her body, watched Beckett walk around to the door on the other side instead of asking her to move over, and he still didn't understand. But he had driven for this man long enough to know one thing. Something had changed tonight, and there was no way to put it back the way it had been. The door closed, and the sound of the rain was cut off at once, leaving only the steady beat of the windshield wipers up front. Beau turned the heater all the way up without being told, then eased the car away from the curb. In the back, Beckett sat close to the door on his side, leaving an entire seat's width between them, and he didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead at the partition in front of him. Adeline sat curled inward, her knees pressed tightly together, the plastic bag still held against her stomach, and she tried with everything she had not to tremble, but the warmth spilling from the vents betrayed her, making both shoulders begin to shake in short waves. Beckett reached inside his coat, took out a neatly folded handkerchief, and placed it on the empty seat between them. He didn't hand it to her. He simply left it there. "Your glasses are completely fogged up," he said, still looking forward. "You can't see anything." She lifted a hand to touch the frames and realized he was right. She had been sitting in the car for some time without noticing that the whole world around her had become nothing but blurred streaks of light. She took off her glasses, blinked several times, and at that exact moment the phone in her coat pocket vibrated. She didn't move. It vibrated again, longer this time, then stopped, then it vibrated again. On the fourth time, she slipped her hand into her pocket, and she didn't answer. She held down the power button until the device shut off completely, then withdrew her hand and placed it on her lap as though nothing had happened. No one said another word about it, but Beau, in the front seat, had clearly heard all 4 vibrations in the silence of the car, and he knew the man sitting behind him had heard them too. Adeline reached for the handkerchief. She had to lean slightly forward, and when she extended her arm, the wet sleeve of her shirt slipped back from her right wrist. Beneath the yellow light of a street lamp passing outside the window, 4 dark marks appeared on her pale skin, round and no larger than fingertips, arranged in a row, with a larger mark on the inside of her wrist. She pulled her hand back quickly and tugged the sleeve down, but it was too late. Beckett didn't reach for her. He didn't touch her, didn't lean closer, didn't make any movement at all. He only turned his head and looked at her, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than before. "Who did this?" In the front seat, Beau immediately took his eyes off the rearview mirror. He placed both hands on the steering wheel at the 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock positions, straightened his back, fixed his eyes on the road ahead, and remained that way for the rest of the drive. He had heard that voice exactly 3 times in all the years he had driven for this man, and every one of those times had ended in something he didn't care to remember. Adeline tightened her hand around the handkerchief. "I tripped, sir," she said, "in the parking garage. The floor was wet. I came down the ramp a little too fast, and I caught myself on the railing, that's all." She said it smoothly, without stumbling over a single word, and that very smoothness betrayed her. It was the explanation of someone who had rehearsed it in her head all the way from the parking garage to the alley. Beckett didn't challenge her immediately. He let her answer sit there in the car for a while, long enough for her to hear how hollow it sounded herself. Then he said, still in that low voice, "I grew up in South Boston, Miss Marsh, in a neighborhood where parents taught their children how to lie to doctors before they taught them how to ride a bicycle." He paused. "Railings don't leave marks like that. Only a person's hand leaves marks like that." Adeline didn't answer. She lowered her head and stared at the white handkerchief crumpled in her hands, and she neither denied it nor admitted it. She simply sat there in silence. Outside the window, the city passed in pieces. Closed storefronts, awnings dripping rain, a man pushing a cart through an intersection beneath the downpour. Bo kept the car at an even speed, not a single mile faster. And he didn't ask the question any driver should have asked by then, where they were going now. Then Beckett spoke, still watching the woman curled into the far corner of the seat. Bo, pull into somewhere that's still open. She needs something hot to eat. The diner sat near the far end of Dorchester Street, a long glass box with a row of faded red vinyl seats and a neon sign missing one letter. Bo pulled the car to the curb and shut off the engine, but he didn't get out. Inside, only 2 customers sat far apart at the end of the counter, and a waitress was leaning against the coffee machine. She looked up when the bell over the door rang, opened her mouth to give the usual greeting, then saw the man who had just walked in. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she put down the stack of menus without offering them, reached for the coffee pot instead, and followed them to a corner booth no one had needed to point out. "Chicken soup," Beckett said. 2 bowls, and a pot of hot tea. She nodded and went straight into the kitchen without asking another word. Adeline sat across from him without taking off her coat, both hands wrapped around the thick ceramic cup the waitress had just filled with hot water. The steam fogged her glasses again, and this time she let it. Beckett sat upright and didn't touch his own cup. He asked nothing. It was that silence that finally made her speak first, and she used the same voice she used when declining an appointment on his behalf. Polite, clear, leaving no room for negotiation. "Mr. Rourke, I'm very grateful for the ride. I truly am, but I want to be clear about something." She set the cup down. "My life outside that building stays outside that building. From the first day I started working there, I made one rule for myself. I would never carry any part of my private life through those glass doors. I don't tell anyone who's calling me. I don't tell anyone how I get home. And I never let you spend even 1 minute worrying about me. That's why I've been able to do this job for as long as I have." She paused for a beat. "Tonight I broke that rule, and I'm sorry. But it's still my problem. You don't need to know. You really don't." Beckett looked down at her hands, at the way she held the cup as though it were something keeping her afloat. Then he spoke. "Every morning, you put a cup of tea on my desk at 7:15. You know I don't drink coffee, and in all these years you've never let anyone in that building know it, because you understand people would think it meant something about me. You know I don't use an electronic calendar. You know I hate being called before 9. You know the 1 week of the year when I don't accept appointments, and you've never once asked why." He stopped, and the only sound left in the diner was the low hum of the refrigeration units behind the counter. "You stand a few steps from my desk every day, year after year. You know everything about me. And I didn't know until tonight that you take the bus." Adeline looked up. "That's not your fault." "I didn't say it was anyone's fault," he replied. "I'm saying that I sit on the 32nd floor, and I know exactly how many crates are sitting in my warehouses tonight, which ship is docking at what hour, and who owes what to whom across the lower half of this city. People pay me because I see the things everyone else misses. And yet there has been a woman pouring my tea every morning, and I didn't see anything at all." He didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't lean forward. There was nothing in his tone that sounded like a promise or a threat. It was simply a fact laid down on the table, like an overdue bill. "I'm not going to force you to tell me anything, Miss Marsh. If you want to finish eating and go home, I'll have Bo take you there, and tomorrow at 7:15 we can behave as though tonight never happened. But if you decide to tell me, you should know that I'll listen to all of it." The waitress brought out 2 bowls of soup, set them down, then retreated quickly. Adeline watched the steam rising from her bowl. She sat in silence for a very long time, long enough for the fat on the surface of the soup to begin settling into a thin film. Then she took off her glasses, placed them on the table, and began to speak. "My husband's name was Elias," she said. "He worked on scaffolding. 3 years ago, he fell at a construction site out in Back Bay." She said it in a flat voice, the voice of someone who had told this story to administrative clerks, call center operators, and people sitting behind glass in different offices so many times that she could no longer hear anything inside the words. "He didn't die right away. That's the part no one prepared me for." She turned the cup slowly in her hands. "They took him into intensive care. The first few days, I counted. By the 4th day, I stopped, Because counting means you're waiting for some kind of marker, and there wasn't one. There was only morning, afternoon, then morning again. I sat in the chair beside his bed, and I memorized the sound of every machine in that room. I can still recognize them now. Beckett didn't interrupt. He still hadn't touched his bowl of soup. The construction company sent flowers, she said. On the second day, a huge bouquet, with a card and everything. I remember thinking that at least they were being decent. Then on the 9th day, their lawyer called the hospital, not me, and said Elias wasn't their employee. They said he was an independent contractor. He had worked for them through 4 winters. He had a key to their equipment storage. He trained 2 new hires. But on paper, he was only a man who picked up work 1 day at a time. She lifted her eyes to him. Do you know what happens when a man gets erased from the payroll, Mr. Rourke? His insurance erases him too. Everything running in that room, the ventilator, the pumps, the bags of fluid hanging from the stand, all of it suddenly became mine. The waitress passed their table, saw both bowls of soup still untouched, and kept walking. On the 8th night, Adeline said, and her voice began to change. I'd been in the hospital for more than a day and a night without going home. I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten. At one point, I fell asleep in the chair and woke up because I thought I heard one of the machines alarming. But it wasn't. It was only a cart rolling down the hallway. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, a woman came over to me. She stopped, and for the first time in the entire story, she had to draw in a breath before continuing. She was wearing a white coat. There was a badge on it. She spoke very softly. She asked if I wanted some water, and she sat down beside me. Then she said the billing department needed me to complete some paperwork so the hospital could continue the current services. Those were the exact words she used. Current services. Adeline placed both hands flat on the table. She gave me a stack of papers and a pen. I remember the pen felt heavier than a normal pen. I remember thinking, why would anyone hand me such a nice pen in a place like this? She showed me where to sign, then turned the page, then showed me again. Did you read it? Beckett asked. I read the first page, she said. I got through maybe half of it. The print was small, and by then my eyes were already like that. I remember asking her one question. I asked what would happen if I didn't sign. She didn't answer. She only looked toward the door of his room, then looked back at me. She laughed. One very short laugh, with nothing inside it. So I signed. I signed everywhere she pointed. I didn't read all of it. No one reads all of it at 3 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Rourke. People don't hand you papers at 3 o'clock in the morning because they want you to read them. Beckett sat motionless. Outside the window, a night bus drifted past, almost empty, spilling yellow light into the diner for a moment, before carrying it away. Elias died 3 days later, Adeline said, and that stack of papers I signed at 3 o'clock that morning, the papers I signed so they wouldn't take anything away from him, is still alive today. It's still alive, sir. It grows every month. It's been 3 years, and it still refuses to die. Before Beau drove her home to Dorchester, Beckett asked her only one question, the name of the company holding that debt, and Adeline gave him 3 words, Sable Ridge Recovery, then added that saying it aloud wouldn't change anything, because she had called them more times than she had called any living person. He didn't answer. He simply remembered the name. When he reached his apartment, he didn't take off his coat. He called Naomi Whitfield at nearly 3 o'clock, and she answered on the second ring, didn't ask what was wrong, only said yes, sir, and waited. He read the name to her, told her to find out who was behind it, then hung up. The sky was beginning to lighten when his phone vibrated again. I've looked into it, Naomi said, but before I tell you the rest, you need to hear this part first. She paused for a moment, the kind of pause a lawyer makes while deciding whether to begin with the worst part. Sable Ridge Recovery leases the 6th floor of the building, at the corner of Congress Street. The landlord is Rourke Harbor. You approved that lease in the summer 2 years ago. Beckett said nothing. Are you still there? Keep going. They don't lend money to anyone, Naomi said. They buy debt. The hospital sells entire bundles of accounts to an intermediary. That company sells them to another company. And by the time the debt reaches Sable Ridge, the remaining purchase price is only a few cents on the dollar. I'm not giving you the exact figure because I haven't finished verifying it, but picture it this way. They bought all of Miss Marsh's debt for about the price of a used car. He heard her turn a page on the other end. She's made a payment every month for 3 years. By my rough calculation, she's already paid them many times what they spent to buy the debt, and according to their current records, the balance they say she still owes is larger than the original amount at the hospital. Outside the window, the rain had stopped, and the sky above the harbor was changing from black to a dirty gray. "Mr. Rourke," Naomi said, her voice quieter now. "There's one more thing. I checked her payment method. She doesn't pay through a bank. Every month for the past 3 years, she's brought cash and paid it in person at the counter." She let the sentence settle. "That means every month she walks into one of your buildings, goes up to the 6th floor, stands in line, pushes cash through the glass window, then walks back out." Beckett stood. He walked to the large window overlooking the harbor, still holding the phone in his hand, though he was no longer truly listening. Down below, the cranes were beginning to move, forklifts crawling along rows of stacked containers like toys, and all that land belonged to him. He could recite the name of every shipping company renting cold storage from him. He knew which doors opened at what hour, knew who carried which keys, knew exactly how many floors in the building at the corner of Congress Street were occupied, and which floors stood empty. He had signed that lease on some afternoon, somewhere in the middle of a stack of other papers, and he couldn't even remember whether he had read the tenant's name. Probably not. People didn't read the tenant's name. They looked at the number on the bottom line. For 3 years, once every month, the woman who placed a cup of tea on his desk at 7:15 had carried cash to an address bearing his name, stood in line there, then returned to work without saying a single word. Beckett had spent more than half his life in a world where everything could be reduced to a direction, where there was always someone doing the harm and someone bearing it, someone holding the valve, and someone standing beneath the pipe, and it had never taken him more than a few seconds to know which way he needed to look. He stood there until the sunlight touched the cranes outside, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know who he was angry at. She arrived at 7:15. Beckett had been sitting at his desk for a long time already, still wearing the same clothes from the night before, and he heard the sound of her access card outside the glass door, at exactly the rhythm he had been hearing for all those years, without ever realizing he had memorized it. The door opened. She walked in, carrying the tea tray, and placed the cup on the right corner of his desk, exactly where it had always been placed, without making a single sound. She wore a long-sleeved shirt, and the right sleeve had been pulled all the way down, almost covering half her hand. Her hair was tied back neatly. Her glasses had been cleaned, and there was no trace of the previous night left on her face, except for a shadow beneath her eyes that the makeup hadn't managed to hide completely. "Good morning, Mr. Rourke." "Good morning, Miss Marsh." And that was all. Neither of them mentioned the alley, the car, or the untouched bowls of soup at the diner on Dorchester Street. They stepped into that morning, as though entering a room that had been cleaned before either of them arrived. She opened her bag, took out the black leather notebook, and placed it in front of him, already open to today's page. The small, neat, handwritten entries arranged by time, one item per line, with any changes crossed out by a single thin stroke and rewritten beneath. He had never used a digital calendar. People had tried setting one up for him several times in the early years, and every time he had simply let it die inside the computer, until a new assistant, who had only been working there for a few weeks, bought a notebook herself and began writing everything down by hand without asking anyone's permission. He hadn't said anything. From that day forward, every morning the notebook had appeared in that exact place. "The Port Authority is calling back at 9 about the pier extension application," she said, pointing to the second line. "I moved the insurance meeting to tomorrow afternoon because they still haven't sent the revised version. Mr. Devane wants 15 minutes at 11. He didn't say what it's about." Beckett looked down at the page. "And this weekend is the end of the quarter," she continued, her voice steady as she moved to the next item. "I'll close this one out and start a new notebook on Monday. I'll keep the old one the way I always do." He nodded without looking up. That too had become routine. Years ago, an administrative employee had suggested moving the old notebooks into the company archive, along with the contract files, and he had said no in the kind of voice that made people understand there was no reason to ask again. He didn't like the idea of pages recording who had met him, and at what time sitting in a storage room that anyone with a door code could enter. Adeline had been the one who heard him say it. Since then, at the end of every year, she had packed the used notebooks into a cardboard box, sealed it, and taken it home. No one had ever discussed it again. There had been nothing to discuss. It was simply one of hundreds of small things she did to keep the 32nd floor running smoothly. just like knowing that he didn't drink coffee, just like placing his tea on the right corner instead of the left. "Anything else?" he asked. "No, sir." She closed her bag and turned toward the door. When she was almost there, she paused for the briefest moment, so brief that anyone else would have missed it. But Beckett didn't, and he knew she was waiting to see whether he would say anything. He didn't. She walked out and closed the door behind her, and through the frosted glass he watched her silhouette sit down at her desk, pull the right sleeve down once more, and begin typing. Near noon, he pressed the button and called her in. Adeline entered carrying the notebook and a pen, stopped in the middle of the room, ready to take notes. "Sit down," he said. She sat in the chair across from his desk, placed the notebook on her lap, and uncapped the pen. "You don't need to write this down." She put the cap back on. Beckett didn't circle around the subject. He had spent the entire morning trying to think of some way to say it that might make it hurt less, and he hadn't found one, so he said it plainly. "Last night you gave me a name. Sable Ridge Recovery. I had someone look into it." She didn't move. "They lease the 6th floor of the building at the corner of Congress Street. That building belongs to Rourke Harbor. To me." The ventilation system hummed through the room, and somewhere beyond the walls someone laughed in the shared workspace, faint and distant, belonging to some other morning. "I approved their lease in the summer 2 years ago," he continued. "I could tell you I didn't read the tenant's name, that it was buried in a thick stack of papers, that I signed it at the same time as several dozen other things. All of that would be true, but I'm not going to say it because none of it changes anything." He placed both hands on the desk. "For 3 years, every month, you've carried cash to the 6th floor of that building to make your payment, and for those same 3 years, their rent has been flowing back into my company." Adeline sat still. She didn't raise a hand to cover her face, didn't sigh, didn't make any of the gestures people usually made when they heard something like that. She simply sat there, her eyes fixed on some point on the desk between them, and she remained silent so long that Beckett began to hear the ticking of the wall clock, a sound he had never even noticed before. She stayed quiet longer than he had expected. Then she lifted her head. "Are you finished, sir?" "Yes." "Then let me say my part." Her voice didn't tremble. It wasn't cold either. It was as calm as the voice she used to tell him that his 9 o'clock appointment had been moved, and that very calmness made it harder for him to look directly at her. "I'm not quitting. I want you to know that first, because I imagine you're waiting to see whether I will." She lowered the notebook onto her lap and folded her hands over it. "I need this job. Not need it in the polite way people say they need something. I need it in the sense that, if I don't have it next month, I don't know what I'm going to do. So tomorrow I'll still be here at 7:15. I'll still put your tea on the right corner of the desk, and I'll still do exactly the work I always do." Beckett lowered his eyes to his hands. "But I'm asking you for one thing," she said. "Never mention this again." He looked up. "Don't mention it again," she repeated. "Not today, not next month, not ever. Don't call me into this office to tell me you've learned something else. Don't leave an envelope on my desk. Don't send someone over there on my behalf. I know you could do all of those things in a single afternoon, and I know you want to." She drew in a breath. "For 3 years, I've survived because I've still had one thing left. Every morning I walk into this building, and for 8 hours I'm a person with a job to do, and I'm good at that job. Here, I'm not a file. Here, no one looks at me and thinks about how much money I owe. You just took that away from me, Mr. Rourke. Now you know, and I can't get it back." She stood. "So I'm asking you for exactly one thing. Don't turn this into the second place I have to walk into with my head lowered. This is the only place I have left." Beckett had no answer. In all the years he had sat in that room, no one had ever stood before him and left him without a sentence ready to give back. And this time the silence belonged to him, not to her. Adeline picked up the notebook and held it against her chest. "You have the auditors at 1 o'clock, she said. "I'll remind you again 15 minutes beforehand." Then she walked out and closed the door very softly behind her. The following Thursday morning, the landline in the small Dorchester apartment rang at nearly 10 o'clock, just as Ruth Marsh had set the kettle on the stove. She made her way out with the help of her cane, sat down in the chair beside the refrigerator, and picked up the receiver. "Hello, I'm calling from the billing department," a man's voice said on the other end. It was young, pleasant, carrying the polished courtesy of someone who had repeated the same opening line many times that day. "I need to verify a few details regarding an account, Am I speaking with Mrs. Ruth Marsh? You are. And what is your relationship to Miss Adeline Marsh? I'm her mother. Yes, thank you. There was the rustle of paper on the other end, the kind of sound meant to make the listener believe there was a desk there, a file, a system. Mrs. Marsh, I only want to ask you one question, because it appears your daughter may not have fully updated the family about the situation. Do you know how much your daughter currently owes us? Ruth didn't answer immediately. Outside the kitchen window, a garbage truck was backing up at the far end of the alley. I'm asking because of this. The voice continued, still every bit as courteous. You're probably already aware of the original hospital balance, but after 3 years, the amount has changed quite a bit. There are additional charges she may not have told you about. We do acknowledge that she has been making payments very consistently, every single month, but as you know, paying regularly isn't the same thing as paying enough. I think someone else in the family should understand the situation, just in case something happens. He left a pause. Would you like me to read the amount to you? Ruth reached over and turned the stove down. Then she spoke, and her voice was neither louder nor softer than when she had first answered the phone. What did you say your name was? I didn't quite catch it. That's all right. Never mind. She said it in the way of a woman who had spent 31 years standing in front of classrooms full of children and knew exactly how much she needed to lower her voice to make the entire room fall silent. I know how much my daughter owes. I've known for a long time. You don't need to read it to me. Mrs. Marsh, I don't think you. Is there anything else you need? The other end went quiet. If not, I'll have to excuse myself, Ruth said. My kettle is about to boil. She lowered the receiver gently, without slamming it down. Then she remained seated in the chair beside the refrigerator. The kettle began to boil, whistled for a long while, then shut itself off because the stove's heat control had been broken since the previous winter, and Adeline still hadn't managed to call a repairman. Ruth continued sitting there. She didn't call her daughter. She didn't get up to make tea. She stayed there until the steam on the kettle lid disappeared, until the aluminum body grew cool beneath her palm, and only when the sunlight had moved from the edge of the table to the middle of the kitchen floor did she finally push herself upright with her cane and pour the water away. That afternoon, Bo Hendricks called Beckett. He wasn't a man who called often. In all those years, the number of times he had personally dialed the man who usually sat in the back seat could have been counted easily. I just picked Miss Marsh up downstairs in the lobby, Bo said. She asked me to take her over to her mother's place, said she'd only be stopping in for 10 minutes. But when she came back out, her face was different. He paused. I asked her about it. She said someone called the old lady this morning, claimed to be from billing. What did her mother say to her? She didn't tell me. She just sat there in silence the entire drive back. Beckett thanked him and hung up. At that moment, the car was parked at the foot of the building on the corner of Congress Street, where he had just gone to inspect an empty space on the second floor, and he had already been sitting in the back seat before the call came. Bo sat up front, his hands resting on the steering wheel, waiting for instructions. None came. The man behind him didn't speak, didn't move, didn't pull out his phone to call anyone. At first, Bo glanced at the clock on the dashboard, then glanced again, and then he stopped. He stopped looking at the time and simply sat there, both hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead at the glass entrance of the building while the man who owned it remained silent behind him until the streetlights outside came on. The 6th floor of the building at the corner of Congress Street was brighter than Beckett had expected. There was no frosted glass, no row of plastic chairs. There was a reception desk made of light-colored wood. A vase of fresh flowers changed every week, and in one corner stood a real plant with thick leaves that someone had taken the time to wipe clean one by one. On the wall behind the receptionist was the company logo, 2 letters intertwined in navy blue, designed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Naomi went in first, handed over her business card, and gave her name. Less than 2 minutes later, the door at the end of the hallway opened, and Warwick Pell came toward them with both arms already spread. Mr. Rourke, he was in his late 40s, wearing a perfectly fitted navy blue suit and a tie secured with a pin, and he smiled with the kind of smile worn by a man who was genuinely pleased. I have to admit, I always thought I'd meet the landlord one day, but I imagined it would be downstairs in the lobby, not that you'd come all the way up here. Please, come in. Coffee? We have a proper machine, not one of those things they keep in the break room. His office overlooked the harbor, On the desk sat a family photograph in a silver frame, a stone paperweight, and a tray of business cards. He took one out and handed it to Beckett. The card was thick, the lettering embossed enough that a finger could feel the raised edges. "We provide medical financial services," Pell said as he sat down. "It sounds dry, but I usually explain it this way because it's easier for people to understand. Hospitals are there to treat patients. They aren't banks. They don't have the machinery to follow an account for years and years. So eventually, they sell those receivables to bring in cash and keep operating, and companies like ours take over the remaining work. Without us, hospitals would have to make up the difference by raising prices for everyone. You see, no one likes to think about it, but everyone needs it." He said it without the slightest trace of defensiveness. Naomi rested the file case on her lap and didn't open it. "We are fully compliant," Pell continued, still courteous. "We hold a state collection license. We're inspected regularly, and I require my staff to record every call. Ask any lawyer in this city and they'll tell you we're clean." Beckett didn't touch the cup of coffee placed in front of him. He reached one hand behind him. Naomi placed a file into it, and he slid it across the desk. "What's this?" "Your lease agreement," Beckett said. Pell turned over the first page, glanced at it, then looked up, still smiling. "Yes, I'm familiar with it. We've paid on time from the very first day. I can have accounting come up right now if you need to reconcile anything. I'm not here about the rent." "Then what are you here about, Mr. Rourke?" Beckett looked at him. "There's a woman who has walked up these stairs every month for the past 3 years, stood in line out there, pushed cash through the glass, then walked back down. Last week, someone from your company called her mother, claimed to be from hospital billing, and offered to read an elderly woman the amount her daughter owed." "Oh." Pell adjusted his cuff. "If one of my employees misrepresented the organization, I'll review the recording and handle it internally. I mean that sincerely. But if you'll allow me to add one thing, contacting a relative within the household isn't illegal. And what you've just described, if you remove the part about someone using the wrong name, still falls within the rules." He leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Rourke, I have tremendous respect for you. Everyone in this city knows who you are, but I have to ask you directly. Are you threatening me?" Beckett stood. He fastened his coat. "Threats are for people who still have choices," he said. Pell frowned, still smiling. The smile of a man who believed he had just heard an elegant line with nothing behind it. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean." "You will." Naomi rose with him, carrying the file case. As they reached the door, Pell called after them, his voice still warm and accommodating. "How much time are you giving me to prepare, Mr. Rourke?" Beckett didn't turn around. He walked into the hallway, past the reel plant in the corner, and the elevator doors closed behind him before anyone could say another word. Naomi had to ask Adeline for the original contract, and she had prepared an entire complicated explanation for why she needed it. But in the end, none of that was necessary. Adeline simply said it was in the bottom drawer at home, inside an envelope she hadn't opened once since the day she brought it back from the hospital. She added that she already knew the number by heart, and she didn't need to look at the paper again to remember what she had signed. The following afternoon, Naomi spread it across the table in the small conference room on the 32nd floor, beneath the overhead light, and began reading from the very first line. She read slowly, underlining, turning pages, making notes in the margins. When she reached the final page, she stopped. At the bottom right was Adeline Marsh's signature, shaky and slanted, nothing like the neat handwriting she used every morning in the scheduling notebook. And beneath that signature, about 3/4 of an inch lower, was a line of small print, the kind the eye passed over because it sat where no one ever looked. Witness. Beside it was another signature, and beneath that was a name written by hand in clear capital letters, one letter at a time. Delfino Conquo. Naomi sat upright. She called Beckett before she even thought to reach for a piece of paper to write it down. "She's kept this document in a drawer for 3 years, Naomi said. "The thing that could overturn the entire case is sitting on the final line of the final page. She never once opened it to look. It took 2 days to find the woman. She no longer worked for Sable Ridge, and she had never worked for the hospital. In an old personnel record, Naomi managed to trace through a liability insurance company. Her job title was field representative, and her most recent contact address was a 2-story house in Quincy. Naomi drove down there on a Saturday afternoon. The door opened, and the woman standing behind it wore pale blue nursing scrubs, her hair tied neatly back, a ring of keys still in her hand as though she had just come home from work. She looked at the business card Naomi handed her, read the entire thing, then raised her eyes. She didn't ask what this was about. "I've been waiting 3 years," she said. Then she opened the door wider. In her kitchen was a wooden table with 2 chairs. She poured water for both of them, sat down, and began talking without needing to be prompted. "They hired me through an online advertisement. The title was Field Representative. During the interview, they said the job was to help patients and their families with paperwork. They gave me the white coat. They told me to wear it because it made people feel safe. They told me to speak softly, to sit down instead of standing, and never to hand over the whole stack of papers at once. Just turn 1 page at a time and point to where they needed to sign." She placed both hands on the table. "I did that job for almost a year. Night shifts only. During the day, family members were still alert. They asked questions. They called someone. At night, they didn't." Naomi took out a copy of the document and placed it on the table. The woman bent down and looked at the name. She stared at it for a very long time. "I remember her," she said. "Not because I looked her up. I remember the face of every person I ever handed a pen to. Every single one of them, ma'am. There were 4 people that night. Miss Marsh was the second." She pushed the paper back across the table. "I remember because she asked me a question almost no one asked. She asked what would happen if she didn't sign. I had been instructed not to answer that question, so I didn't." She was silent for a moment. "I quit the following spring. I went back to school at night, and now I work the morning shift at a nursing home on Hancock Street. The pay is much lower. But there, when I put on a white coat, it means what a white coat is supposed to mean." Naomi told her that if she agreed to testify, the lawyers on the other side would question her closely, that someone might try to dig through her private life, and that the process could go on for a long time. The woman listened to all of it. "Do you need me to sign something now?" she asked. Naomi said her side could arrange compensation for her time and travel expenses. The woman shook her head. "I'm not taking a single dollar from any of you," she said. "For 3 years I've thought about those 4 people. Now someone has come knocking on my door because of one of them, so I'm going." The plastic bag from that night in the alley had never left Beckett's mind, and he hadn't asked anyone a single question about it, because asking would mean going against the only thing she had ever asked of him. But one Tuesday evening, Beau told him that she had refused the car again and said she would make her own way home, and Beckett drove himself. He didn't ask anyone to come with him. He parked 4 blocks away, in front of an old office building his company didn't own. An 18-story building with a granite lobby and a security guard dozing behind the desk. He went inside, said he was waiting for someone, then stood in the corner of the lobby with his hands in his coat pockets. At nearly 11:30, the service elevator doors at the far end of the lobby opened. She pushed out a cleaning cart with 2 buckets of water and a stack of towels, then stepped out behind it. She was wearing a gray uniform, pants and shirt the same color, made from cheap fabric that had stretched at both knees. Her hair was pinned up. She wasn't wearing her glasses. On the left side of her chest was a name patch stitched in white thread, and the name on it wasn't hers. She had pushed the cart halfway across the lobby when she saw him. She stopped. Both hands remained on the handle, and she stood exactly where she was, neither stepping back nor moving forward, unable to say a single word. Beckett walked toward her. He said nothing at all. He took off his coat, folded it, and placed it on the bench against the wall. He removed his cufflinks and rolled his sleeves to his elbows, one side at a time, slowly, like a man preparing to do something he had already decided upon. Then he walked around behind the cleaning cart, took the second mop resting there, dipped it into the bucket, pressed it into the wringer, and lowered it to the floor. She looked at him. He didn't look back. He began to mop. They entered the service elevator together. The doors closed, and inside that narrow metal box, there was the smell of floor cleaner and the steady sound of cables pulling above them. And neither of them said a word. The 14th floor was dark, lit only by the emergency lights and the glow coming through the window at the far end of the hallway. She pushed the cart out first, placed the wet floor sign at the corner, then started from the far left side. He started from the far right. The hallway was long, carpeted down the middle with tile running along both edges, and they moved toward one another from opposite directions, each working one side, their mops drawing overlapping arcs across the floor. He didn't know how to do it properly. He wrung the mop too dry, pushed too hard, and left streaks in places. She didn't correct him. They met near the middle of the hallway, passed one another, and kept going. The clock on the wall near the copy room moved forward one small mark at a time. Somewhere in the building, an air conditioner came on and then shut off again. They finished one side, pulled the cart to the other, and continued. Neither asked the other a question. Neither offered an explanation. When her mop reached the wall at the end of the hallway, she stopped. She stood there with both hands still gripping the handle, her back turned toward him, and her shoulders began to shake. Then she broke down crying. She cried aloud, the way someone cries after holding it inside for far too long, and finally discovering there is nowhere left to put it. And she didn't turn around, didn't sit down, simply remained standing there and cried, both hands still wrapped around the mop handle, as though she would fall if she let go. Beckett didn't walk toward her. He didn't offer her anything. He leaned his own mop against the wall and stood several steps away, and he stayed there. He stayed through all of it, without saying a word, without looking away, until her crying began to soften, then broke into uneven pieces, then became nothing but breathing. Afterward, the two of them sat on the top step of the emergency stairwell, where a small window looked down over the parking lot. She wiped her face with her sleeve. "You wrung it too dry," she said quietly. "If you mop like that, the dust sticks to the floor instead of coming off." Beckett looked down at his hands, still wet all the way to his wrists. He didn't smile. But he didn't argue with her either. Naomi told her in the small conference room, between two stacks of papers, in the ordinary voice lawyers use when saying things they assume everyone already knows. "You're his legal wife. You have the right to request his complete original medical record, at any time. You don't need a reason." Adeline looked up. "I have that right." "You've always had that right." She sat still for a moment. "No one has told me that in 3 years." She submitted the request on Wednesday morning, and they told her to come back Friday afternoon to collect it. She went alone. She didn't ask anyone for a ride, didn't tell Beckett, didn't tell her mother. In the medical records department in the hospital basement, a young employee handed her a thick cardboard envelope and a pen to sign the receipt, then added that there was still a bag of personal belongings stored under the patient's name, and asked whether she wanted to take that as well. Adeline said yes. She went out to the parking lot, sat inside the car she had rented by the hour, and didn't start the engine. She opened the envelope right there. Inside were pages and pages of printed paper, typed lines perfectly even, every section marked with codes and timestamps in the corners. There were vital signs, charts, medication records, doctor's notes written in a language meant only for people in the profession to understand. She turned the pages one by one. She recognized the days when she had sat in the chair beside his bed and memorized the sounds of the machines. She even recognized the afternoon when 2 nurses came in for a shift change. Then she turned to a page she had never seen before. There was a date at the top. It was the 7th day. Beneath it was a brief typed nursing note stating that the patient had become responsive and alert for approximately 40 minutes, was oriented to time and place, and was able to communicate. Adeline read that line 3 times. That Saturday afternoon, she hadn't been at the hospital. She had been gone for almost 2 hours, at a clinic a few blocks away for an appointment she had already postponed twice, and had been told she shouldn't postpone again. She remembered walking very quickly on the way back. She remembered that when she returned, the room looked exactly the same as when she had left. No one had said anything to her. She turned the page. The next sheet was a form. Near the top was a checked box, indicating that the patient had declined further surgical intervention, and another box stating that he declined aggressive resuscitation measures if his condition deteriorated. Both boxes had been marked. At the bottom of the page was a signature. The handwriting slanted, large, trembling slightly near the end, but she recognized it immediately because she had seen those same letters on notes stuck to the refrigerator door for years. Beneath it, in the section for the witnessing nurse's notes, was a typed line recording the patient's own words, enclosed in quotation marks like every other entry on the page. The patient said that his wife was pregnant, and he didn't want his child growing up beneath bills carrying his father's name. Adeline sat motionless in the car. She didn't cry. She had always imagined that if she ever discovered something like this, she would break apart, but nothing broke. There was only a strange sensation, like missing a stair in the dark and feeling the entire body fall before the mind could understand what had happened. For 3 years, she had told herself that if she had read more carefully that night, if she had asked one more question, if she hadn't signed, everything might have been different. For 3 years, she had carried that guilt to work every morning, carried it onto the bus, carried it into those buildings at night, and all along, the man lying in that room had made his decision before she ever made hers. He had awakened for 40 minutes, and no one had told her, and he had used those 40 minutes to do one thing. She lowered the paper onto the passenger seat and reached for the bag of personal belongings. Inside was a worn leather wallet, a ring of keys, the old phone whose battery had been dead for years, and at the very bottom was a small, square paper box, tied with a ribbon faded by time. She opened it. Resting on tissue paper inside was a silver hair clip. Her birthday had fallen in the month after his accident. Adeline lifted it into her hand, and she sat in that car for a very long time, her eyes still dry, her fingers closed tightly around the hair clip that from that day forward she wore in her hair every morning, including the morning she walked into the Rourke Harbor Tower to interview for a job. She had lost the baby 2 weeks after his funeral, her body simply giving up under the weight of grief and exhaustion. Naomi had finished assembling the file by Tuesday evening, the original contract with the witness signature on the final page, the sworn statement from the woman in Quincy, the record of entries and exits from the intensive care unit that night, and a comparison showing that the interest dividends, page required by state law, had not been included in the stack of papers Adeline signed. She told Beckett she would file everything Thursday morning, and that she rarely dared to say anything with certainty, but this time she was certain. On Wednesday morning, she called him before 7 o'clock. "We can't file anymore," she said. Last night, the entire Sable Ridge portfolio changed hands. Beckett was standing in the kitchen, not yet wearing his coat. "Who bought it?" "A fund registered in Delaware," Naomi said. "I had to trace it through 3 layers before I found the person behind it." Conrad Halloran. In the kitchen, the coffee machine could be heard dripping into the pot. "He paid 3 times market value," she continued. "No one in this industry pays that kind of price for a portfolio like this. No one. He didn't buy it to collect the money. He bought it to hold it." Beckett said nothing. "Mr. Rourke, there's one more thing. I spoke to the broker again. Pell never went looking for a buyer. The other side came knocking on his door. They specifically asked for a portfolio that contained the name Marsh." He lowered the phone onto the kitchen counter and stood there. Halloran hadn't created this. That was the first thing Beckett thought, and he thought it with perfect clarity, almost coldly. The debt had existed before any of this. The woman had been paying it before any of this. And Conrad Halloran hadn't known who Adeline Marsh was at any point in the past 8 years. He hadn't needed to know. He had only needed to notice one thing. He had sat on the Port Authority Commission long enough to know that the man in the Rourke Harbor Tower never paid more than necessary for anything. And then suddenly word began circulating that this man had sent his private attorney digging through 3-year-old hospital records belonging to an office employee. That single detail was enough. In 8 years, Halloran had voted to block Beckett's dock permits 3 times, had obstructed him everywhere he could, and had never once found anything he could truly hold over him. Now he had. Beckett had pointed it out himself, simply by doing something because he couldn't bear to sit still. He called Sullivan Devane just before 7. By 9 o'clock that evening, 4 representatives from 4 labor unions were seated in the large conference room on the 32nd floor, with cold coffee sitting untouched on the table. Beckett stood at the head of it. He didn't make a long speech. He said a portfolio had just changed ownership, that the man who bought it sat on the Port Authority Commission, and that he needed to know who in this city had helped arrange the transaction within 48 hours. The oldest man in the room, the representative of the longshoremen, placed both hands on the table. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "we can ask around the docks, the warehouses, the inspection offices. But what you just described is a paper transaction between 2 companies in different states. We don't have anyone in places like that," another man put it more plainly. "And besides, sir, if he already signed the deal, then he's the legal owner of those papers now. Even if we uncover the broker, it won't change anything." Sullivan walked them out to the elevator. When he returned, he closed the conference room door and leaned against it. "You called 4 unions into this building at 9 o'clock at night," he said. "By tomorrow morning, the entire harbor will know something is happening, and Halloran will know too." Beckett remained at the head of the table, both hands braced against the wood. "You just confirmed for him that his guess was right." Sullivan said. Before tonight, it was only a suspicion. Beckett didn't answer. Beyond the glass, far below, the cranes remained motionless beneath the floodlights, and the entire stretch of harbor was still his. In 20 years, no one had ever taken anything from his hands. But that night, for the first time, someone had taken something, and it was nothing more than a stack of papers bearing the name of a woman who still placed a cup of tea on his desk at 7:15 every morning. Beckett called every name on that list throughout Saturday and nearly all of Sunday. Some people didn't answer. Some answered, promised they would look into it, then never called back. By Sunday afternoon, he understood that the entire city was waiting to see who won before deciding which side to stand on, and that this was exactly the weakness in other people he had always known how to use. Near 11 o'clock that night, his phone vibrated. Unknown number. Mr. Rourke. Beckett recognized the voice immediately. The rough voice of a man who had smoked for 20 years and then quit. The same voice that had read aloud, 3 times in a row, the decision denying his peer extension application in the Port Authority Commission meeting room. I know it's late, Conrad Halloran said. But I thought you'd rather hear this from me than from someone else tomorrow morning. Beckett said nothing. I had a visitor this afternoon. She came on her own. No call ahead, no introduction from anyone. She rang the bell at my house, and when my people opened the door, she handed them a business card from your own company. On the other end of the line, ice clicked against the side of a glass. She brought a cardboard box with her. Inside were several leather-bound notebooks. You know the ones I'm talking about. Beckett rose from his chair. She let me look through one of them, Halloran said. Mr. Rourke, I have to admit, she has beautiful handwriting. Dates clearly written, times clearly written, who entered your office at what hour and how long they stayed, including meetings that don't exist anywhere on your official calendar. I found 2 names I know very well. Both men sit at the same table with me on the commission. And the interesting part is that both meetings took place during the week before the vote. Beckett remained silent. She said she was the one who wrote the entries. She said she was prepared to sign a sworn statement, confirming that every line was written in her own hand. Halloran paused, and his voice lowered. The satisfaction had disappeared from it, replaced by something almost like curiosity. I asked her what she wanted. I assumed she'd ask for money. Anyone who comes to my house on a Sunday afternoon asks for money. What did she ask for? She told me to withdraw the dispute. That's all. Withdraw it so the hospital could unlock her mother's file before tomorrow morning. Beckett could hear the blood beating in his ears. I called my lawyer at 7 o'clock tonight, Halloran said. The dispute has been withdrawn. The hospital will have confirmation in its system before dawn. The old lady will be placed on the surgical schedule. Then he added, slowly, I've waited 8 years for an afternoon like today, Mr. Rourke, and the funny thing is, I didn't have to do a thing. She brought it straight to my front door herself. The line went dead. Beckett drove to the tower in 20 minutes. He went straight to the 32nd floor, through the darkened shared office area, and before he even opened the door to his office, he knew no one would be inside. On his desk, in the exact right-hand corner where it had been placed every morning for all those years, sat a cup of tea. It had gone completely cold, and a thin film had formed across the surface. Beneath the saucer was a folded piece of paper. He opened it. The handwriting was small and neat, identical to the writing in the notebooks that were now sitting inside the home of a man across the city. She wrote that she had received more from him than she had any right to receive, and now it was her turn to repay it. She wrote that for 3 years, someone had always been signing on her behalf. Doctors signed. Banks signed. Her husband signed. Everyone made some decision about her life while she sat outside in a hallway waiting. This time, she had signed for herself. She wrote that she knew exactly what she was taking from him, and she wasn't asking him to forgive her, because asking wouldn't be right either. She only hoped he would understand that she hadn't done this for revenge, and she hadn't done it for money, but because out of everything she still had left in this world, there was only one person she could still save. The final line said that he shouldn't look for her, and beneath it, one more line, written smaller than the rest. Tomorrow morning, make your own tea. Let the boiling water sit for a little while before you pour it. Don't pour it right away. At 3 o'clock on Monday morning, Beckett called Sullivan Devane to the 32nd floor. He arrived within 15 minutes, his coat thrown hastily over his pajamas, and when he stepped into the office, He found the other man standing in front of the large window with a folded piece of paper in his hand. "The East Container Yard," Beckett said without turning around. "Close it. Don't accept another crate starting this morning." Sullivan stood still in the middle of the room. "Cold storage rows A and C," Beckett continued. "Close those too. And call transportation. Tell them I'm pulling every tractor unit off today's schedule. Mr. Rourke, are you making the calls or am I?" Sullivan made them. He stood in the corner of the room, speaking quietly into the phone. 3 calls, each lasting less than 2 minutes, and every time he hung up, he remained still for a moment before dialing the next number. The harbor didn't belong to Beckett Rourke. It belonged to the state, with its own authority, its own docking schedules, and no one in the world could simply order it closed. But the ships arriving there had to unload their cargo somewhere, and that somewhere was the East Container Yard. Refrigerated freight had to go into cold storage, and cold storage was in rows A and C. Cargo leaving those warehouses had to be loaded onto tractor trailers, and those tractor trailers ran according to the schedule of a company owned by the man standing before the window on the 32nd floor. By 7 o'clock that morning, the first ship reported that there was nowhere to receive its cargo. By 9 o'clock, there were 11. By noon, the number of ships anchored offshore waiting for somewhere to unload had reached 41, forming a line that stretched all the way out toward the waters beyond the island, and on the highway leading into the port, container trucks stood bumper to bumper without moving. Every cab left running because of the cold. In the large conference room on the 32nd floor, someone had set up a whiteboard showing the estimated losses by the hour, and after the second update, no one read the numbers aloud anymore. Sullivan Devane closed the conference room door. "You need to hear me say one thing," he said. Beckett didn't answer. "The 4 longshore unions have about 2,000 people on today's shift. 2,000 people. Mr. Rourke, if they can't clock in, they don't have a shift. If they don't have a shift, they're short on money at the end of the month. It isn't the shipping company owners who take that loss. It's the people who have been standing on those docks since 6 o'clock this morning." He stepped closer to the table. "Mr. Halloran is sitting in his house, and he isn't losing a penny. Those 2,000 people are." Beckett was silent for 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds felt longer than the call he had made before dawn. "Get today's timesheets," he said. "All 4 unions. Pay every person for the full shift as if they worked it normally, including the allowances. Take it from my personal account, not the company. Transfer it today. Don't make anyone wait until payday." Sullivan looked at him. "And the yard and the warehouses? They stay closed." At the hospital, Adeline sat in the 3rd chair from the aisle in the 4th floor waiting room. Her mother had been taken in early that morning, and they had told her the surgery could last until the afternoon. She hadn't brought a book. She didn't turn on her phone. It had been switched off since the previous afternoon. There was a round clock on the wall, and she watched its second hand travel in circle after circle long enough to realize that it ran slightly faster than the watch on her wrist. She raised one hand and touched the silver hair clip in her hair. She knew nothing about the ships anchored offshore, knew nothing about the line of container trucks on the highway, didn't know that only a few miles from where she sat, a man had just authorized a payment to compensate 2,000 people he had never met. She only sat there wondering what she had just traded away. Her mother would live. She knew that, or almost knew it. And that had been the only thing she wanted when she rang the bell at that man's gate the previous afternoon. But she also knew exactly what was inside those notebooks, because she had written every line herself, and she knew whose hands she had just placed them into. Sometime near noon, she bent forward, covered her head with both hands, and remained that way for a long time. On the 32nd floor, Beckett folded the note and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. Then he picked up his overcoat. "Where's Beau?" "Downstairs in the lobby. Tell him to take me to Beacon Hill." By dawn on Tuesday, Conrad Halloran's front door opened before Beckett could ring the bell a second time. He was wearing a sweater and house slippers, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept a single night in the past week. He didn't ask why Beckett was there. He simply stepped back and let him in. Only one lamp was on in the corner of the living room. Several framed photographs sat on the mantel, and Beckett noticed one showing 2 young men standing in front of a truck. The man on the left, unmistakably Halloran 20 years earlier. 41 ships, Halloran said when he sat down. "Someone from the Port Authority called me before 6 this morning. He asked if I knew what was happening. I told him I didn't." He looked down at his hands. "You think I want your pier permit? For 8 years, everyone has thought that. You thought it too. He said the next sentence in the voice of a man who had repeated it inside his own head thousands of times. A voice worn thin from being used too often. My brother's name was Dermot. He worked for you in the East Yard. That winter, a shipment came up short, and you'd only been in charge for a few months. You needed the whole harbor to know who you were. You fired him. I understand that part, Mr. Rourke. A man in your position had to fire somebody. I understand. But you didn't stop there. You made calls. You called all 4 unions, the shipping companies, even the private warehouses over in Chelsea. By March, he was applying for work more than 10 miles from the harbor, and people still knew his name. He fell silent for quite a while. He looked for work for 4 years. 4 years, Mr. Rourke. By the 2nd year, his wife had taken the children back to her mother's house. By the 4th, he stopped leaving home. He died the following autumn, and the paperwork said heart disease. Halloran looked up, his eyes dry. Then 2 years later, in that very same yard, they caught an accountant keeping 2 sets of records. The entire harbor knew. Your people knew. You knew. He leaned forward. I waited for 1 phone call. 1. All you had to do was call one of those 4 unions and tell them the boy hadn't taken anything. He was already dead. He didn't need a job anymore. It would have cost you nothing. You never called. You stayed silent for 8 years because making that call would have meant admitting that when you were first coming up, you'd been wrong about something, and you couldn't bear that. He leaned back in his chair. Last week I heard you'd sent your lawyer digging through hospital records for a secretary. Do you know what I thought? I thought, so he does know how to spend money for another person. It just wasn't my brother. Beckett sat motionless. He didn't deny a single word because there wasn't a single word he could deny. He remembered that winter. He remembered how many times he had picked up the phone that afternoon, and he remembered the satisfaction he had felt when he realized people were afraid of him. He also remembered the day the accountant was caught. He remembered sitting at his desk, looking out over the harbor, and telling himself that too much time had already passed. You withdrew the dispute, Beckett said. The old lady has been in surgery since yesterday. I know, but part of the file is still locked. Financial Services needs the portfolio holder's signature to clear it completely. Otherwise, when the first round of medication comes due, they'll block it again. Beckett took out his phone, made a brief call, then placed it on the table between them. Naomi Whitfield will have a document ready before noon today. An official statement bearing my signature, sent to all 4 unions, and entered into the industry record. It will state Dermot Halloran's name clearly. It will state that he had nothing to do with the missing shipment that winter. It will state who actually did it. And it will state that I learned the truth 2 years after I fired him and chose not to say anything. Halloran sat very still. There will be no money attached, Beckett said. I'm not offering you anything else. You sign the financial release, and I sign this. If you don't sign, the yard stays closed, but that statement still goes out. The man sitting across from him raised one hand and covered his eyes for a moment. Then he reached for the pen on the table. The surgery ended in the middle of the afternoon, and they told Adeline that everything had gone well, that the kidney had begun functioning right there on the operating table, that her mother would remain in intensive care overnight, and she would be able to visit her the next morning. They also told her that the financial hold had been completely cleared before dawn, and that she didn't need to worry about the first round of medication. Adeline thanked them. Then she went to her mother's apartment because she needed to gather some personal things to bring to the hospital. A few changes of clothes, a comb, a pair of house slippers. The Dorchester apartment was dark and cold. She turned on the bedroom light and pulled open the drawer of the nightstand to look for her mother's reading glasses. Inside were several blister packs of medicine, a pocket calendar, and at the very bottom, lying face down, was a blue school notebook, the kind with graph paper inside, the kind sold in little neighborhood stores near schools. She picked it up. The first page was dated to an autumn month 3 years earlier. She recognized the handwriting immediately, round and even, leaning slightly to the right, the same handwriting that had covered classroom blackboards for 31 years. This month you brought the money on the 4th. You said the new place pays better. I asked the name of the company, and you had to think for a moment before answering. My daughter has never had to think before telling the truth. Adeline turned the page. Today you came in the afternoon. You hugged me, and your hands smelled like floor cleaner. You said it was because they had just cleaned the hallway at the office. I said, "Is that so?" She turned another page. Her fingers began to tremble. You were telling me something about work, and fell asleep in the middle of the sentence, your head resting against the back of the chair. I sat there and watched you sleep. I watched for a long time. I didn't wake you because I think this is the only place in the world where you dare to sleep. Some pages contained only a single line. In 1 month, she read that her mother had canceled a medical appointment so she wouldn't have to spend more money on transportation, and had reminded herself not to tell anyone. On another page, Ruth had written that she had called a different hospital to ask whether there was anywhere less expensive, and they had said no, and she had sat in the kitchen for a long time before finally standing up. There was one page written on a Thursday morning less than 3 weeks earlier that contained only a few words. Someone called this morning. They wanted to read the number to me. I told them I already knew. I didn't want to hear that voice say my daughter's number out loud. Adeline sank down onto the floor, with her back against the side of the bed. She turned to the last page that contained writing. The handwriting there trembled more than on any page before it. The letters were larger, and the lines no longer ran straight. If I go first, and someone finds this notebook, please tell my girl something for me. Tell her I knew. I knew everything from the first winter. I knew there was no new job that paid her more. I knew about the nights she didn't sleep. I knew what that smell on her hands was. I was afraid to say it because I know my daughter. As long as she believed I didn't know, she could keep standing. If I told her, she would collapse. So I have stayed quiet for 3 years. I have stayed quiet and watched her grow thinner. It is the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. And Adeline broke apart. She sat on the floor of her mother's bedroom, surrounded by blister packs of medicine and a slipper that had fallen from the drawer, clutching the blue school notebook against her chest, and she cried the way she had been unable to cry for the past 3 years. Unable to cry at the hospital, unable to cry at the funeral, unable even to cry that afternoon, when she had sat in the car in the parking lot with the typed page resting on her lap. She cried out for her mother. She called, "Mom, Mom," like a child, in an empty apartment where no one could hear her, until darkness completely covered the world outside, and the bedroom lamp became the only light still burning on the entire floor. She returned to the 32nd floor on a Thursday morning, carrying no bag and no notebook. Beckett was standing by the window. On the desk sat a cup of tea he had made himself, and she could see that he had let the water cool for a while before pouring it, exactly as she had written in the final line of her note. "My mother came home from the hospital yesterday," she said. "I know." She stopped in the middle of the room. "I gave those notebooks to him. I'm not apologizing. If I could go back to that Sunday afternoon, I would do exactly the same thing again. I wasn't waiting for an apology." He turned to look at her. Then he said something he had never told anyone in his life. "When I was 14, my mother started having chest pain. We took her to the emergency room at the hospital near our neighborhood, and they made her wait. Late that night, a staff member came out and said her file didn't qualify, that she should go home and try another place the next day. She couldn't walk anymore, so she stayed in the hallway, sitting on an orange plastic chair." He continued, his voice unchanged. "I ran back to the neighborhood. I knocked on every door. I carried a tin box with me, and I went from one house to the next, and people really did give me money. Some of them gave me the last bill they had in their wallets. By the time I got back to the hospital, the box was heavy. But she had already died in that chair." Adeline said nothing. "So when I learned that you had been carrying cash up to the 6th floor of my building for 3 years, he said, you weren't the first thing I thought about. That plastic chair was." Very quietly, she asked him whether, after everything that had happened, he intended to live differently. Beckett didn't answer right away. "No," he said. "I'm still the man I've always been. Last week, 2,000 people couldn't work their shifts because of me. And I knew that would happen before I made the call. I paid them, but I still made the call. A man refused to help me on Friday, and next month he won't be able to rent warehouse space from me anymore. I'm not going to pretend to you that it happened by accident." He looked directly at her. "I'm not becoming a different person. I'm only changing what I aim at. Don't confuse those two things. People do that all the time, and then they get hurt." She nodded. Then his eyes lifted to her hair, to the silver hair clip still fastened there as it was every morning, and he said that for all those years he had looked at it every day, without ever knowing it was the last thing her husband had managed to leave behind for her. 6 months later, on the ground floor of the Rourke Harbor Tower, there was a small office with a brass plaque engraved with the name Colleen Fund. It purchased hospital debts belonging to working families in the county, paying exactly what collection companies would have paid for them, then erased the debts and sent letters through the mail to tell the families they were gone. Adeline Marsh ran it. The office windows looked directly into the alley between the tower and the brick wall of the old parking garage. One late-season rainy night, she was leaving work late and passed that way. She stopped because the weak yellow light above the service door was no longer there. It had been replaced with a new lamp, white and bright, illuminating the full length of the alley so clearly that there wasn't a single dark corner left. Beckett stepped out through the side door. He didn't say anything. He took off his coat and placed it around her shoulders, just as he had on that first night. This time, she didn't take it off. This story leaves behind 3 things. First, being poor has never been a crime, and asking for help has never meant defeat. The only thing we truly lose is those nights when we sit alone because we believe we aren't allowed to trouble anyone. Second, what breaks a person is often not the cruelest individual, but the most polite places, the ones with the most beautiful logos, the ones that know how to invite us to sit down and place a pen in our hands at 3 o'clock in the morning when we are exhausted and have no one beside us to help read the paper before we sign it. And third, power and money don't define a person's dignity. What truly tells us everything is how that person treats someone weaker than themselves when no one requires kindness from them and no one is watching. If today's story touched your heart, please press the like button, share it with someone you believe may need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so that every day there can be another meaningful story waiting for you. How do you feel about Adeline, and about everything Ruth quietly endured for 3 years? Please leave a comment, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days beside the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.